one of the symbols of American aviation, a manned rocket, the world's first Mach 2 fighter, an aircraft that was more dangerous for its own people than for its enemies, a widowmaker, a flying coffin. Hello aviators, Sky here, and today we are looking at one of the most striking examples of the desire for leadership, as well as the price that had to be paid for this desire. I present to you the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. The Korean War of the 1950s was a horror for the region, a milestone of the Cold War, and a time of discovery for the US Air Force, which virtually dominated the skies without fear of any enemy, and then faced the MiG-15. And while the earlier enemy aircraft were not a problem, collisions with the new MiG often turned aerial adventures into hellish battles. The conclusions for the Pentagon were unpleasant. Soviet aviators were far from being as simple as they were thought to be, and to guarantee superiority, radical solutions were needed. A big fan of radical solutions was Clarence Kelly Johnson of the Lockheed Corporation, one of the most famous American aircraft designers. Having studied the experience of the new aerial warfare, he identified two main needs. Aircraft must fly higher and much faster. In 1952, Lockheed began studying concepts that involved a radical increase in these parameters. Altitudes were increased from 15 to 20 kilometers, and speed from just over Mach 1 to at least 2. It was supposed to be a single-engine aircraft that would achieve the required parameters due to its lightness and advanced aerodynamics. So advanced that many of its solutions were only studied on flying labs, such as the Douglas X-3 Stiletto and Lockheed X-7 missiles. You must understand that Mach 2 in the 1950s was a little studied area with a lot of problems. Much research had been carried out in labs, wind tunnels, and flying test beds. It is difficult to count how many configurations were rejected until they formed what became known as the L-246. Soon, the military arrived. It was clear from the tender they announced that everyone was on the lookout. Republic Aviation with their unusual AP-55 based on the XF-91 Thunderceptor, North American with their no less unusual NA-212, Northrop with their N-102 Fang, and Lockheed, which presented the L-246. Also, the program involved the creation of a new engine, which was undertaken by General Electric with their J-79 project. The result of the competition was announced in early 1953, with Lockheed winning. The deadlines were tight. Just a few months later, the assembly of prototypes began. Thus, the XF-104 Starfighter was born. And there it is in front of us. The XF-104 fuselage is as compressed as possible. Most of the rear half of the plane is occupied by the engine. In front of it is the cockpit, and then the nose cone. Semicircular air intakes are located on the sides. Speed was everything, and to minimize drag, the wing was made very compact. It was a pair of small trapezoids of low aspect ratio, so thin that their leading edge was about 4 mm thick. This knife received ailerons, slats, and flaps, but there was no room left for the landing gear and tanks. They were moved into the fuselage. The suspension was intended to be directly at the wingtips, so that missiles, the ubiquitous AIM-9 Sidewinder, or fuel tanks did not require additional pylons and reduced the risk of flutter. The tail unit is T-shaped, unusual for a fighter, but on Mach 2 it was better, and there was simply no place on the fuselage to put the stabilizer drives. However, with such a tail, fears arose that the pilot would hit it during ejection, so they installed an unusual catapult with ejection not up, but down. It looked fast. While the length of the aircraft reached 15 meters, wingspan barely reached 6.7 meters. While its counterparts had large delta or swept wings, the XF-104 looked more like a rocket than an airplane. Speed was everything. Or vice versa. Interesting fact, in the process of testing the layout of the XF-104, Lockheed decided to use it in another of their projects, which at first glance seemed to be the complete opposite of a high-speed fighter. They took the fuselage, made a number of adjustments to it, replaced the tail unit, and replaced the miniature low aspect ratio wing with, on the contrary, a hefty and very elongated one. This deprived the plane of speed, but gave it a very long flight duration, range, and altitude. Thus, with the ingenuity of Kelly Johnson, in the carrying hands of the CIA and the Air Force, the U-2 Dragon Lady reconnaissance aircraft was born. The XF-104 prototype made its maiden flight in March 1954 at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Soon, the second plane joined it. The flights confirmed the aerodynamic superiority of the aircraft. They could break the sound barrier even without the use of an afterburner in a small dive. With an afterburner, the speed reached Mach 1.79 at an altitude of 18 kilometers, over 1,000 knots, 1,900 kilometers per hour. Not bad, considering that General Electric did not have time to complete the standard J79 and installed on the prototype the outdated J65, licensed versions of the British Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire. These successes, however, were accompanied by a wave of problems with controllability, a tendency to the Dutch roll, flutter, and problems with systems, including another big novelty. The now iconic 6-barrel M61 Vulcan gun had just appeared, and it was the XF-104 that became its first user. Solving these problems came at a high price. The test program was completed, but both prototypes were lost. Subsequent machines were very different from the first pair. The length and weight increased, the landing gear and drives changed, the tail was modified, the air intakes received adjustable inlet cones, the cockpit received a normal ejection seat fired upwards. A big innovation was the introduction of a boundary layer control system. The air taken from the engine at low speeds blew around the extended flaps, increasing their effectiveness and reducing the minimum flight speeds, which I will talk about later. Finally, the new J79 engine arrived, which was much cooler than the J65. The pressure ratio increased from 7:1 to 13.5:1. The temperature in front of the turbine from 850 to 930 degrees Celsius. Thrust from 32 to 44 kilonewtons, and in afterburner it was already under 70 kilonewtons. The J79 later was installed in a bunch of famous machines, from Hustlers to Phantoms, but at that point it was completely new and promised super performance to the Starfighter. The customer was impressed. In 1955, Lockheed received a contract for 17 YF-104A aircraft for military testing, as well as an option for hundreds of jets in the future. The Lockheed assembly line clearly demonstrated the company's ambitions. It was capable of producing up to 20 aircraft per day. All of it got to work in 1958, when the first production F-104A entered the US Air Force fleet. The F-104 rushed to break speed and altitude records. In 1958, the plane climbed to an altitude of 27,811 meters, and a year later to 31,513 meters. The speed record is 1,220 knots. These were incredible figures that were surpassed only a decade and a half later by the Soviet MiG-25. But even without taking into account the records, the F-104 was very impressive. It was the world's first serial Mach 2 fighter. Of course, the plane found a job at NASA. 12 machines served in the interests of the agency from 1956 to 1994, having managed to participate in a bunch of programs from X-15 to the Shuttle. The NF-104, relatives of the X-15, have an interesting story, a kind of semi-rocket planes that received reaction control systems, or RCS, which are used on spaceships, as well as a rocket engine. With their help, as intended, the aircraft would be able to reach maximum altitudes and remain controllable in a rarefied atmosphere, with altitudes of more than 36.8 kilometers being reached during testing. Not without drama. There were accidents with the planes, one of which almost killed Chuck Yeager. Plus, the disaster of 1966, when during a joint promotional flight of aircraft proudly carrying General Electric engines, an F-104N collided with the XB-70 bomber. The Starfighter and the Valkyrie were lost, taking the lives of several people with them. The F-104's performance was impressive, but aviators soon saw the price they had to pay for this performance. The exotic design gave the aircraft better speed, but its competitors preferred more conventional solutions for a reason. Excellent performance at high speeds cost the fighters absolutely terrible performance at low speeds. The lifting force of the small, thin wing was pathologically insufficient. Takeoff and landing speeds of the serial F-104 ranged between 160 to 200 knots. This is a lot. In addition, the boundary layer control system required keeping the engine at high speeds. If you reduce thrust, the system will turn off, the lift will drop, and so will the plane. The F-104 was an obstinate, unforgiving bird, and while the testers could cope with it, for ordinary pilots it was downright dangerous, and as the fleet grew, the enthusiasm began to wane considerably. At the same time, the plane began to lose relevance. In the early 1950s, everyone wanted a pure fighter, but by the end of the decades, priorities had shifted towards interceptors and bombers, and these roles were tried out by the F-104. The F-104C became the fighter bomber, which received a boosted engine and 3 additional pylons for missiles and bombs. The aircraft was also modified in the interceptor version. They even wanted to adapt some of the planes for the use of Air-2 Genie, air-to-air missiles with 2.5 kiloton nuclear warhead. The problem was that the original pure fighter was not very suitable for these roles. For an interceptor, its combat radius was insufficient, and for a bomber, it carried little load, and again, did not feel very good at low speeds and altitudes. At this time, the base fighters went to Taiwan, where from time to time, relations between the islanders and mainland China became tense. There, they were mainly demonstrators of force, although there were also episodes of battles with the Chinese J-6, copies of the Soviet MiG-19. On the one hand, they showed excellent combat performance during high-speed missile attacks, but on the other hand, they emphasized a drawback. In a dogfight, the Starfighter was, let's say, not impressive. In 1965, the F-104s went to Vietnam, but even there were few pure air battles, and it was not particularly effective against ground targets, so as a result, gave way to the main air star of that war, the F-4 Phantom II. Lockheed tried to make their aircraft more versatile, but it was obvious that this could only be done through a major redesign. This redesign was to become the CL-1200 Lancer, a multi-role fighter project based on the Starfighter. But Lancer did not come to fruition. It was considered as a proposal for the 4th generation fighter, but did not reach the finale of the competition, where the YF-16 and YF-17 were running, the future F-16 and FA-18. Despite Lockheed's best effort, the US Air Force began to lose interest in the Starfighters. Preferring other, more suitable aircraft, they seriously cut order volumes. 296 aircraft were made for them, although initially it was planned to make more than 700. They had to open a window to Europe. Seeing the interest of the Allies, primarily Germany, Lockheed took the F-104C and, at the request of the Germans, modified it, added 2 more pylons, enlarged the tail, and boosted the engines. The F-104G was offered not only for purchase, but also for licensed production. Not only Germany, but also other countries became interested in this proposal, fueled by a large-scale lobby and PR company. Orders poured in for Lockheed, and the F-104 soon began to be produced by the hundreds by several consortia in parallel. Meanwhile, service in potentially frontline Europe required the ability to work with the risk of losing airfields. While many were moving towards VTOL aircraft, the F-104 decided to shorten the landing distance by using a landing hook and arresting gears, like on an aircraft carrier, and shorten the takeoff run radically by installing a solid fuel booster on the aircraft and launching it like a rocket. The story with the hook continued, but the booster was rejected. Too cool. But we already know what problems American pilots faced on the F-104. The F-104G, on the other hand, is a fighter bomber, operating at medium speeds and altitudes, and is also heavier. What could possibly go wrong? The Starfighter was a record holder in accidents. Even in the US Air Force, the accident rate of the F-104 was several times higher than that of other aircraft of its generation. The Allies had it even worse. The number of accidents involving the loss of both the aircraft and pilots grew at an alarming rate. In Germany and then in other countries, the nicknames Flying Coffin and Widowmaker began to be attached to the Starfighter. And the question, why having a decent choice, military officials chose, to put it mildly, not the most optimal option, soon led to a wave of corruption cases and scandals. Risk mitigation measures were taken, some systems were updated, ejection seats were replaced, and new protocols were implemented, but the reputation was damaged. The result of all this ruckus was the gradual withdrawal of the starfighters from the fleet. The US Air Force had in fact retired most of the aircraft from active service by 1969. They served in Europe until the mid-1980s. The Italians persisted the most, creating the most advanced version of the F-104S, which served in the Italian and Turkish Air Forces until the beginning of the 21st century. A total of 2,578 units were produced, of which Lockheed itself only made 741. Well, the F-104 Starfighter turned out to be a controversial aircraft, to put it mildly. On the one hand, it was a real breakthrough, the performance of which made all its predecessors terribly outdated. Again, more than 2,500 were made, and they served for almost 50 years. An impressive result. On the other hand, the F-104 is an example of how some qualities are sacrificed in a headlong race for others. Designed for speed and altitude, the Starfighter was limited in other capabilities, which deprived it of versatility, and any attempts to change its role were either ineffective or turned into disasters. The result? The reputation of an extremely controversial machine, which in the beginning everyone dreamed of getting, and which in the end everyone dreamed of getting rid of. On this, I think we can end this epic story. Like and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to watch the videos early, see some exclusive behind the scenes content, or just support the channel, consider joining our Patreon community. Fast flights on safe planes, and soft landings to you.